I used to live in the city. The urban lifestyle is honestly what I always envisioned for myself. I'm not going to get into it, but after an extremely traumatic experience, I couldn't bear even the smallest noises. I began to hate noise. In general, my psychiatrist told me I had developed a rare case of phonophobia, so that pins and needles feeling you get when your foot falls asleep. It's kind of like that, but in my chest, always there like my body was brack ring for something that wasn't coming. Every car horn or slamming door felt like a jolt straight to my nerves. I couldn't keep living like that. About 3 years ago, I found a cabin buried deep in the Pacific Northwest. I don't want to say exactly where it was, for reasons you'll soon understand. But all I'll say is that it was somewhere in Oregon. It seemed perfect. Very few neighbors. No traffic. Barely any cell service. What really sold me on it, though, was the lack of noise. It was just me and the peace and quiet. For the first time in months, I thought I might actually feel safe. The cabin itself was small, but cozy. To be fair, it was exactly what the listing had promised. You could tell it had been built to last, with thick wooden beams and a sturdy stone fireplace. It smelled like pine and old books when I first walked in. You know, that kind of earthy scent that's almost comforting. Think like one of those old cabin-style bed and breakfasts for any of you who have gone skiing before the nearest neighbor lived. About a 10-minute walk down a narrow dirt path. I didn't meet her right away, though. For the first few days, I just soaked in the silence. I'd wake up to the sound of birds instead of sirens, and at night, the only thing I heard was the wind brushing through the trees. It was like the whole world had pressed pause, and I could finally breathe again. I did all my work from my laptop, so there really was no need for me to connect with the outside world beyond that. About a week after I moved in, there was a knock at the door. The cabin obviously had no doorbell, so those knocks were something I'd have to get used to. I opened the door, expecting it to be my neighbor, and it was a moderately old woman carrying a basket of preserves. Like she just stepped out of a Hallmark movie. She introduced herself as Michelle and told me she lived about 10 minutes down the trail, which didn't sound far at all until you factored in how dense the woods were. I mean, you could get turned around in there just looking for firewood. She was in her late 60s with oddly long gray hair and these piercing blue eyes that made you feel like she could see right through you. She wasn't rude exactly, more like blunt. She welcomed me to the woods and extended the basket toward me, like she was expecting me to take it. I didn't really have much of a choice. She was practically shoving it in my face. I know it sounds hospitable, but her vibe seemed a little off, if that makes any sense. I grabbed it impulsively, but I admit I had never been treated that way by a neighbor before. It wasn't anything crazy, but it wasn't something I was used to. I thanked her as I took the basket, and she looked at me like she was expecting me to say something else. I honestly didn't know what else to say, so I just smiled. She kept staring at me awkwardly, which confirmed my suspicion that this woman didn't interact with a lot of people. Eventually she spoke. She said these were her exact words, which I'll never forget. Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe. It wasn't something a normal person would say to someone else. It was like she was reciting from a rule book. It honestly sounded more like a warning than advice. I nodded, smiled, and turned to go back inside. After shutting the door, I stood there in silence,
waiting to hear her footsteps walk away. She didn't walk away for a good 45 seconds, which was probably the strangest part about the whole interaction. Despite the weird vibe, I did appreciate her kindness. She seemed reclusive but not unfriendly, the kind of person who'd help you if you asked, but wouldn't go out of her way to pry. I told myself it was nice to know someone was close by, even if I didn't plan on needing her. I didn't even bother looking in the basket. I just set it down in the living room and forgot about it. There was a thunderstorm that night, which is extremely rare for Oregon, but it does happen. I lit a few candles and curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the fact that the power was flickering every few minutes. Some of you
Might find that kind of isolation scary, but I actually loved it. For some reason, my brain wasn't freaked out by the natural sounds of the thunderstorm. It was actually that specific storm which gave me that realization. I listened intently to everything outside, and it was I say soothing. But of course, that peaceful feeling didn't last a few hours after the storm started. There was a knock at the door that nearly made me jump out of my skin. I say knock, but it was really more of a banging. It was loud and definitely not natural. Like whoever it was didn't care that it was pouring outside. My heart started pounding, and I began to feel that god-awful tingly sensation in my chest. After hesitating for a few seconds, I grabbed the flashlight and got up to check who it was. I looked through the little glass window pane next to the door. It was Michelle, soaked to the bone and clutching a flashlight. I opened the door and she spoke before I even had a chance to greet her. She blurted out that she saw someone near my woodpile and that I should know about it. I was beyond confused, but her words were incredibly concerning, and that took precedence. I stepped out onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the rain, but I couldn't see anything but trees. I asked her if she was sure, and she nodded. Her eyes kept darting to the woods, like she was expecting someone to emerge from it any second. The whole thing was pretty freaky. I kept looking around, but there wasn't much I could make out between the darkness and the chaos of the storm. Before I could say anything else, she told me to be careful and began walking away without waiting for a response. I watched her head back down the path toward her cabin, clearly unfazed by the pouring rain. I stood there until the glow of the flashlight disappeared out of sight, and then I went back inside. The literal second I shut the door, I realized her story was riddled with holes. How could she have seen someone near my woodpile if her house was 10 minutes away? She must have been on my property to begin with. Why the hell would she be snooping around my cabin during a thunderstorm? Was she lying? It didn't sit right with me, but marching over to her house in the middle of a thunderstorm was the last thing I was going to do. Still, I had to do something. I locked up the cabin as securely as I could and sat in my room listening. The storm started to die down after a while, but I still felt pretty uneasy. A few more hours passed without incident, so I decided that it was probably safe to go to sleep. I can't remember exactly what time it was, but sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of a branch snapping just outside my bedroom window. I'm a really light sleeper, so I was 100% POS positive. It was a branch snapping and not something else. I froze in place for a few tense seconds, listening. Eventually, I crept to the window, half hoping I wouldn't see anything at first. I didn't, but then I spotted her, Michelle. She was standing at the edge of the... Felt like forever, and I finally mustered the courage to peek again. She was gone. I genuinely didn't know what to do. I hadn't exactly pegged her as dangerous, just weird. But at that point, I was having second thoughts. It didn't make sense. Why would she try and warn me earlier if she was the one poking around? I didn't sleep for hours. I was pretty dead set on just staying up until sunrise. A few hours passed and I was starting to get tired as I finally began letting my guard down. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't like the banging from earlier. It was actually kind of quiet. Still, I wasn't going to get up under any circumstances. The pins and needles started up again as I quietly made my way over to the door. I took an inconspicuous glance through the pain and frozen horror. It wasn't Michelle. It was a burly-looking bald guy with a thick beard. I had to fight every bone in my body not to yell out in fear. The situation instantly went from a 6 to a 10. As quietly as I could, I retreated to my bathroom, locked the door, and called the police. As I was on the phone with them, I started to hear banging on the front door, like someone was repeatedly smashing it with a heavy object. The operator told me help was on the way and instructed me not to hang up. I sat there more terrified than I'd ever been in my entire life. Eventually, the front door gave way, and I heard it crash open. I genuinely thought I was going to die. That man, whoever he was, started smashing things in my cabin. At least that's what it sounded like. All I could hear was the sound of glass breaking and wood splintering. I didn't dare make a sound. Luckily, that man didn't seem to look for me, because I never heard his footsteps leave the living room. Eventually, the smashing sound stopped, and I was sitting in complete silence again. I had been fighting off a panic attack the whole time. To my surprise, the police actually arrived pretty quickly, but not soon enough to catch that guy in the ACT. He was long gone. I pleaded with the officers to help me out, but they were downright useless. They did a pathetic search of the surrounding property, but that was it. They wouldn't even agree to search the woods, saying that it was too dense, and they were unlikely to find him there anyway. I begged them to accompany me to Michelle's house at least, which they agreed to when we got to her property. My jaw literally dropped. The entire cabin was abandoned. The cops confirmed this and said no one had lived there in decades. I told them they had to search it for squatters, but they told me there was no reason for them to do that. They tried to tell me that there was no clear signs of habitation, so it would be a waste of time. I damn nearly lost my mind when I heard them say that I tried to argue, but they more or less told me that living in the woods was a risk I was taking, and was not their problem. They left after that, which infuriated me. I obviously moved out of that cabin, but not before spending one more night there. It was awful, but I made it through without anything happening. Things have been good for me since then, but I still constantly think about this experience. Some of my superstitious friends have theorized that Michelle was actually a spirit that was trying to protect me, and that she was really just trying to watch over my property. For whatever reason, I don't believe in the paranormal. So I think it's much more likely that two people, her and that man, had been squatting in that abandoned cabin. I just still don't understand why they decided to target me, or why Michelle would bother to warn me if she were planning on breaking into my house. I don't think I'll ever know.